Hello everyone, it's Mimi here. BMS working in the NHS. And today's video will be about tissue processing and embedding, which is part of the IBMS specialist portfolio in cellular pathology. So, just a quick introduction to this video. It will be short and sweet, I promise. It will be focused on the fourth subsection of the specialist portfolio called tissue processing and embedding. I will discuss knowledge requirements, competence requirements, reflective statement, evidence of achievement, Q&A suggestions, evidence ideas, and some helpful tips to make candidates' portfolio really good. With all that said, I hope you will enjoy the content of my video and I hope you will learn a lot. So let's dive into the third subsection of the first section: tissue preparation techniques, tissue processing and embedding. The knowledge requirement explains what knowledge is expected of the candidate in relation to the relevant subsection. Candidates should be able to demonstrate their knowledge at the specialist level. Think about what knowledge they had as a Band 5 BMS. How would that differ to the knowledge of a Band 6 BMS? That specialist level of knowledge would allow the candidate to troubleshoot, problem solve, verify or validate. The first knowledge requirement is principles and practice of paraffin wax tissue processing for a range of tissues. Candidate needs to have the knowledge and understanding about the principles and practice of paraffin wax tissue processing. To test their knowledge, you could ask the candidate, what is processing and what are its principles, how do they process samples in your lab, whether they process all samples in the same way or not, how could processing affect the end product, which would be the stained slide. What is the difference between the old-style processors, microwave-assisted models, and the new generation rapid automated processors such as Sakura X120, Leica Histo-Hero Polaris 3, or Milestone Pathos, Magnus? What are their benefits and limitations, and what could happen to the sample if the processing was done incorrectly? When addressing this knowledge requirement, candidates should consider fixation, dehydration, clearing, wax infiltration, reagents used, various tissue types and their processing schedules, various factors that affect processing like vacuum, temperature, and agitation, conventional versus rapid versus microwave processing, limitations of processing, suitability of wax processing, and so on. The second knowledge requirement is influence of processing schedules on the quality of sample preservation for subsequent analysis. Candidate needs to have the knowledge and understanding about the effects of processing schedules on quality of sample preservation. You could ask the candidate to name processing schedules they use in your lab, and why, to specify which processing schedules they would use for various tissue types and sizes and why, to explain how processing schedules can affect the quality of the sample preservation for subsequent analysis like H&E, IHC, or molecular testing, and what would happen to the sample if a wrong processing schedule was selected. When addressing this knowledge requirement, candidates should consider various processing schedules for various tissue types and sizes, various processor types like conventional, automated or microwave-assisted, effects of processing on subsequent analysis, staining quality, and tissue morphology, consequences of poor processing. For example, what would happen if biopsies were processed on the extended or fatty schedule, or if large fatty tissue samples were processed on a rapid schedule suitable only for small biopsies. The third knowledge requirement is relative merits of different processing reagents and schedules. Candidate needs to have the knowledge and understanding about merits of different processing reagents and schedules. You could ask the candidate to name processing reagents they use in the lab and why, what do these reagents do during the processing, what the risks and hazards associated with those reagents are, what are their limitations, to name processing schedules they use in the lab, whether processing reagents differ in different processing schedules, or whether processing reagents differ between the old-school conventional, new generation rapid automated processors and microwave-assisted processors. And if so, why and how do they differ? When addressing this knowledge requirement, candidates should consider common reagents used during processing, alternative reagents that can also be used during processing, pros and cons of processing reagents, health and safety risks associated with processing reagents, limitations of reagents, suitability of reagents, variation of reagents used, possible substitutes for routinely used reagents, conventional versus automated versus microwave processing, rapid, extended or routine processing, schedules and so on. The fourth knowledge requirement is effects of heat, pressure and vacuum on tissue processing times and tissue morphology. Candidate needs to have the knowledge and understanding about the effects of heat, pressure and vacuum on processing times and tissue morphology. You could ask the candidate what the effects of heat, pressure and vacuum on tissue processing and morphology are, to name advantages and disadvantages for each. How would they optimize tissue processing in relation to heat, pressure, and vacuum, or what heat, pressure and vacuum could do to the tissue if applied incorrectly? When addressing this knowledge requirement, candidates should consider how heat, pressure, and vacuum affect the overall speed processing, how they can affect tissue morphology and lead to shrinkage, hardening, cellular damage, loss of detail, altered staining properties, protein coagulation, pore infiltration, soft mushy tissue, compression, distortion, crush artifacts, pore morphology, and so on. The fifth knowledge requirement is principles and practice of resin processing. Candidate needs to have the knowledge and understanding about the principles and practice of resin processing. You could ask the candidate to explain what resin processing is and when would they use it over the traditional wax processing, what the key steps of resin processing are and how do they differ from the wax processing, what the advantages and disadvantages of resin processing are, what types of resins can be used during resin processing. When addressing this knowledge requirement, candidates should consider when resin processing would be used, think of the sample types where resin processing would be used, reagents that are used during resin processing, advantages of superior morphology resin processing offers, section thickness or resin blocks, specialized application of resin processing, general steps of resin processing like fixation, dehydration, infiltration, embedding, and polymerization, types of resins used, possible advantages and disadvantages when compared to routine FFPE processing in histology like technical complexity, staining approach, cost, time, safety, and so on. The sixth knowledge requirement is principles and practice of a range of tissue embedding techniques, and potential errors that may arise. Candidate needs to have the knowledge and understanding about the principles and practice of various tissue embedding techniques and potential errors. You could ask the candidate to explain what is embedding, to name embedding techniques and highlight the ones they use, to name errors that may arise during embedding, and to explain how they would resolve the errors. When addressing this knowledge requirement, candidates should consider use of wax or resin, freezing, manual and automated embedding, their principles and practice, effects of pore processing on embedding, tissue orientation, potential errors like air bubbles, overheating, cooling, cross-contamination or tissue loss. The seventh knowledge requirement is correct orientation for embedding a range of tissues. Candidate needs to have the knowledge and understanding about the correct tissue orientation during embedding. You could ask the candidate to explain what is orientation and why it is important, to explain what could happen if tissue was not correctly orientated during embedding, to name special instructions used during embedding for certain specimens and why they are used, to state what would happen if special instructions were not used correctly, or to name tissues that require specific orientation and why. When addressing this knowledge requirement, candidates should consider the impact of embedding on sample reporting, importance of orientation, impact of pore orientation, possible special instructions like for alopecia cases, sample types that require orientation during embedding, orientation method, ways of communication for orientation, traceability, training and competency. The eighth knowledge requirement is risks and hazards associated with the use and disposal of processing reagents. Candidate needs to have the knowledge and understanding about the risks and hazards associated with processing reagents. You could ask the candidate to name the risks and hazards associated with the use and disposal of processing reagents used in the lab, to explain how they would mitigate those risks and hazards, and what preventive measures they apply when using and disposing processing reagents. When addressing this knowledge requirement, candidates should consider health hazards, safety hazards, environmental hazards associated with processing reagents used, COSH, SOPs, PPE, regular bodies, waste segregation, risk assessments for processing reagents, RITR, HSE, preventative measures, and so on. The ninth knowledge requirement is risks and hazards associated with the use and disposal of embedding media. Candidate needs to have the knowledge and understanding about the risks and hazards associated with embedding media. You could ask the candidate to name the risks and hazards associated with the use and disposal of embedding media used in your lab, explain how they would mitigate those risks and hazards, and what preventive measures they apply when using and disposing embedding media. When addressing this knowledge requirement, candidates should consider health hazards, safety hazards, environmental hazards associated with embedding media used, COSH, SOPs, PPE, regulatory bodies, waste segregation, risk assessments for embedding media, RITR, HSE, preventative measures, and so on. Competence requirement is basically a combination of knowledge, skills, and experience candidate needs to perform a job to a satisfactory standard. Candidates' chosen evidence should demonstrate these competence requirements. The following competence requirements need to be met for this subsection. The first competence requirement is prepare tissues prior to processing. Candidates should be able to prepare tissue prior processing. Does the candidate know how to prepare tissue prior processing and why? Do they follow local procedures and SOPs correctly? When addressing this competence requirement, candidate could consider fixation, dissection, inking, inflating tissue like lungs, decalcification if needed, preparation of various sample types, sample size, choosing the right tissue cassettes, proper labeling and documentation, and so on. The second competence requirement is evaluate, select, and use the appropriate processing protocol for a range of samples, maintaining audit trail records, as appropriate. Candidates should be able to evaluate, select and use appropriate processing schedules for various samples, and maintain audit trail. Which processing schedule candidate use in your lab? Do they know why there are multiple processing schedules? Do they know when to use each of them? Do they know what could happen if tissue was processed using incorrect processing schedule, and why? Do they know how to resolve processing issues? Do they know how to maintain audit trail records for processing? When addressing this competence requirement, candidate could consider various tissue types processed in your lab, sample size, processing schedules available, processing type like automated, manual or rapid, traceability, record keeping and so on. The third competence requirement is select and use the appropriate processing reagents. Candidates should be able to select and use appropriate processing reagents. What processing reagents does the candidate use in your lab? Can they select the correct processing reagent? Do they understand why they are selecting and using those reagents? Does the candidate know what those reagents do during processing? Do they know what could happen if processing reagents were selected or used incorrectly? When addressing this competence requirement, candidate could consider common versus alternative reagents, reagents used during conventional, rapid or microwave-assisted processing, PE versus resin processing reagents, health and safety hazards associated with reagents used, their advantages and disadvantages and so on. The fourth competence requirement is perform processing and embedding procedures on a range of tissues. Candidate should be able to perform processing and embedding on various tissues. Does the candidate routinely perform processing and embedding on a range of tissues? Do they follow SOPs and local methodologies when performing processing and embedding? Do they know how to select and use correct processing schedules? Do they know which embedding technique to use? Are they aware of special instructions for embedding, and can they follow them? When addressing this competence requirement, candidate could consider SOPs, methods used, their training and competency, type and size of samples, processing schedules available, embedding techniques and so on. The fifth competence requirement is select and use the appropriate embedding medium. Candidates should be able to select and use appropriate embedding media. What embedding medium does the candidate use in your lab? Do they know why and when to use appropriate embedding media? Do they use different embedding medium for different samples? Do they use the embedding media safely? Do they follow local protocols and SOPs when selecting and using appropriate embedding media? When addressing this competence requirement, candidate could consider common and alternative embedding media, conventional versus automated embedding, media for freezing versus FFPE versus resin embedding, health and safety hazards associated with various embedding media, possible advantages and disadvantages of using various embedding media and so on. The sixth competence requirement is use a range of automated tissue processors. Candidates should be able to use a range of automated tissue processors. What tissue processors does the candidate use in your lab? Do they use them correctly? Do they select the correct tissue processor for a range of tissues? When addressing this requirement, candidate could consider conventional, automated, rapid and microwave-assisted processors, types of samples each can be used for, size of samples, local protocols and SOPs, health and safety hazards associated with range of processors, advantages and disadvantages of various processors and so on. Encourage the candidate to use examples from their practice. The seventh competence requirement is correctly orientate a range of tissues when embedding. Candidate should be able to correctly orientate tissue during embedding. Can the candidate correctly orientate a range of tissues when embedding? Does the candidate follow the special instructions during the embedding? Do they know what tissue or samples require special attention during embedding and why? Do they follow local methodologies and SOPs when orientating tissue at embedding? When addressing this competence requirement, candidate could consider SOPs, methodology used, training, competence, sample types that require orientation, communication regarding orientation and so on. The eighth competence requirement is perform basic maintenance and troubleshooting of tissue processing and embedding equipment. Candidate should be able to perform maintenance and troubleshoot issues with tissue processing and embedding equipment. Does the candidate know how to deal with processing and embedding equipment during maintenance? Do they know how to perform the maintenance? Do they know how to troubleshoot processing and embedding equipment? Do they know how to record troubleshooting and maintenance of processing and embedding equipment? Can they verify if the equipment is fit for use following service or repair? When addressing this competence requirement, candidate could consider daily, weekly, and annual maintenance, need for servicing, potential sources of problems with equipment, corrective and preventive actions that can be introduced to prevent problems, record keeping, verification, validation and so on. The ninth competence requirement is troubleshoot problems which may arise, including root cause analysis, as appropriate. Candidate should be able to troubleshoot, including performing root cause analysis. What problems can the candidate deal with? Can they solve them? Do they know why certain problems occur? Can they perform root cause analysis? Do they know how to record their actions during troubleshooting? When addressing this competence requirement, candidate could consider potential problems they may encounter, corrective actions taken, preventive actions, record keeping, verification and validation and so on. Each section also contains reflective statement which is asking the candidate to summarize their role in the lab in the context with each section. When they complete all the subsections within each section, they will be required to write a reflective statement. They also need to write a personal reflection on their training and why they chose their evidence. To prepare for that, ask them to write a smaller reflective statement for each subsection. What is their role and context of this subsection within the lab? What does their evidence demonstrate? Ask them to write a smaller justification as to why they chose their evidence for this subsection. Also ask them to write about what was their training like when to this subsection. Writing a smaller reflective statement at the end of each subsection will then make it much easier for them at the end of the section. Each subsection also has evidence of achievement. This is a part where you, the training officer, sign the candidate off as competent and fit to practice as a BMS at the specialist level. By doing that, you will confirm that the candidate can work in accordance with local SOPs relevant to this subsection. This will also confirm that candidate has answered questions set by you to test their knowledge and skills relevant to this subsection. And you will also confirm that candidate's chosen evidence demonstrates their competence, relevant to this subsection. The candidate will need to be signed off as competent by an internal assessor for each subsection. They can be signed off by you, the training officer, senior BMS overseeing relevant section, or by the training lead. These are some example questions you could give your candidate to test their knowledge and skills about this subsection. These should be based around the knowledge and skill requirements mentioned earlier. These are some more example questions you can ask your candidate to complete, to test their knowledge and skills about this subsection. Supporting evidence should be selected by the candidate. It needs to be based around the competency requirements and be relevant for each subsection. The evidence should allow the candidate to demonstrate their competence in each subsection. It should be specific and relevant to the candidate's in-house practice. It should also demonstrate candidate's specialist competence. If you would like to see specific ideas for supportive evidence, please have a look at the video for trainees. Link will be included in the video description. I would also like to share with you some helpful tips that can make candidates' portfolio look really good. Ask them to try and present the information in various formats such as tables, pictures, photographs, diagrams, flowcharts, graphs, or even videos, if they can. This nicely breaks down a lot of text that is usually present in specialist portfolios. Ask them to try and make it a little bit more interesting to the reader, which will be you, and eventually the assessor. Ask them to try and put themselves in your or the assessor's shoes. How would they like to read hundreds of pages of plain text? There is a saying I really like, and it goes like this: a picture 1,000 words. I will make a video where I will share with you my evidence I used for my portfolio back in the day. Hopefully that will help. Also ask them to try and use various types of evidence, not just one type, like case studies, for each subsection. They could use experiments, case studies, annotated results, annotated photographs of them performing tasks, evidence of troubleshooting, annotated EQA results, nonconformances, validation verification evidence, comparisons of different approaches and their pros and cons, control material production, certificates of course attendance with reflective statements, annotated images or charts, and so on. Ask them to try and bring in their personality. Ask them to think about the ways they like to learn best. If experimenting, let them perform experiments. If they like troubleshooting, let them perform troubleshooting. Ask them to choose something that demonstrates their specialist understanding, knowledge, and skills, and how they apply this in their practice. And one more thing, ask them to keep the competence requirements in mind when they are selecting their evidence. Good evidence will tick off several requirements. And this brings me to the end of today's video. Hopefully you now have a better understanding about the knowledge and competence requirements for this subsection. And I hope you also have a better idea what questions you can choose to test candidates' knowledge. And my final take-home message? Keep those requirements in mind when selecting questions and guiding the candidate. Bye for now.